You're talking about a society that, for until quite recently, its marginal existence.
You couldn't get a cold or you'd die. And you couldn't be in the water, you'd get an infection, you'd die. Like, everything killed you. The dog bites you, you die. You step on a nail, you die. That's the way it was. Like, imagine racing a little kid, good chance he's gonna die.
Getting to age 5 would be, I think, is your benchmark.
Like, there wouldn't be that strong attachment. Like, there wouldn't be. It was quite common, you just spread your kids out. You left some here and there. Yeah, you couldn't feed them. Most of the time it was relatives. You'd stay for a while, maybe you'd think it was temporary. You'd stay with your cousins and that sort of thing.
The execution of Mrs. Workman, an honest, industrious and pious wife and mother, took place in the jail yard here, behind public view on the morning of Thursday, 19th of June. The deceased, who lived in Moortown, never made what could properly be termed a confession, but never disguised or attempted to disguise the fact that she had beat her husband with a stick, which he had seized hold of for the purpose of beating her, which she wrenched out of his hands. She held in her right hand a white pocket handkerchief and a bunch of white flowers, and these continued to be held by the hand when the body dropped. After hanging about 20 minutes, she was buried in a grave prepared immediately under the scaffold, into which the body had previously descended to give it the necessary fall.
Ontario was, and largely arguably remains, the British colony of Upper Canada, engineered in the manner of Georgian England, then scarcely emerged from feudal times, to rest on the backs of a lower class who knew and understood their place, and a ruling class to determine what that would be.
The immigration scheme started in 1869 with Maria Rye, and they officially ended in Ontario in 1939. The only reason they were bringing children to Canada was to put them out to work. They weren't here to be loved, not here to be a family member. They were disposable. The vast majority of these children came from families in need, families that had fallen upon hard time for any reason, be it a death of a parent, illness, a loss of job. They were feeling like they were doing the best that they could do for their child, and in times of need, they were turning their children over to an organization that would look after the child, only to find out that their child had been shipped out of the country and they had no idea where. The children were all the way from toddlers up until the age of 18, but you can't put a 2-year-old out to work. So what they would do with the younger children is they would foster them out until they became old enough to work. And then when they were old enough to work, say 5 or 6 years of age, they would then either charge the foster family a fee for having that child in their home, or they would remove the child from the foster care and then indenture them out to work. They were disposable. If they didn't work out, if the farmer didn't want to pay the money, if they got sick, they were sent back to the receiving home.
History does not vanish, dwell in monuments or precincts of bone and stone. It accumulates. Where and to whom we are born, advantaged or disadvantaged, loved or unloved, is the running sum of our ancestors. The imperatives of their survival in times rife with injustice, hardship, and death, passed down like christening gowns, and pieced into what we call social norms. The documentary you are about to see is a social history, an introduction of past to present in the name of the future, undertaken in the names of those still trapped in historic cycles of injustice and despair, and inspired by the staff of Bernadette McCann House, a women's shelter and support service at Pembroke, Ontario. Before multinational corporations ruled the world, empires were the business of kings, who competed for raw resources and labor acquired by plundering territories occupied by unwary Indigenous peoples or First Nations, who in the case of Ontario had lived here peaceably as 5 distinct nations, of and by the land, for over 9,000 years. In the mid-1700s, arch-rivals French King Louis XV and George III, CEO of the British Empire, were locked in a deadly competition for control of North America. The British had long established colonies along the Atlantic seaboard, while the French had small settlements along the shores of Lake Ontario throughout New France or Quebec and Nova Scotia. But both wanted more. When the French lost a bloody battle here on the Plains of Abraham at Quebec City, the British set about claiming their newly won territories, turning to the south to raise funds by imposing massive taxes on their own colonies, provoking a revolution, which Britain lost, leaving countless soldiers and families who had supported them, known as Empire Loyalists, fleeing through hostile territory to safe havens from the Maritimes to Ontario, where 20,000 would settle, carving new beginnings out of expanses of wilderness along the St. Lawrence River at Kingston, the Bay of Quinte, and the Niagara Peninsula. Wealthy families and British military officers, ranks bought and paid for by the aristocracy, many later to be employed by the Crown to ensure strict social order in a new British colony, Upper Canada, to be engineered by this man, Lieutenant Colonel John Graves Simcoe. Ottawa writer Valerie Knowles is the author of this definitive history of Canadian emigration.
I mean, there was a great fear on the part of the French Canadians, of course, that their settlements would be overrun by English-speaking Americans. And so he was encouraging Protestant, English-speaking immigration into Upper Canada. That's why you have the creation of Upper and Lower Canada, and then you evolved into Canada East and Canada West.
English Protestants to be assembled in the form of a society, in Simcoe's words, forever free of any spirit of democratic subversion. A soldier, born into minor gentry, Simcoe had financed his own rise through military ranks to lead troops in the American Revolution, winning his first promotion shortly before being invalided home at age 30, where his star had ascended through marriage to Elizabeth Gwillim, a 16-year-old orphan and heiress of immeasurable wealth. Accompanied by his wife, 2 children, military staff, and a legion of household servants, Simcoe arrived at naval headquarters at Newark, or Niagara-on-the-Lake, in the summer of 1792. With considerable ceremony, he struck a parliament and imposed the rule of British law. Before moving on to Fort Toronto, a military garrison he renamed York, to organize district courthouses and jails, appoint magistrates, and proclaim statute labor laws obliging all future settlers to contribute to annual road-building projects. Simcoe's plan was to persuade the wealthy to serve as administrators and magistrates in exchange for vast grants of land in areas richest in resources, particularly standing timber. A vision he pursued in the face of growing opposition for 4 years, until being recalled in 1796, leaving behind a home in York, and a system of laws descended from a medieval belief in the divine right of kings and king-makers, which has endured for 2 centuries and counting, setting ancient, antithetical, and foreign principles in Ontario stone. The underlying purpose of the British legal system was to protect the king and his inner circle, or patriarchy, from the masses, by enacting economic and social levers designed to ensure ongoing flows of wealth and benefit to those at the top. Indeed, so-called common law offered little in the way of rights to the common man, even less to women, and none to children, beyond being abandoned in or near a swamp or public roadway at detriment to the public purse, a reality women's shelters deal with on a daily basis.
I do think, I mean, I'm being frank here, but I do think that they're considered property, and that's horrible. I think no human being is property.
Veteran domestic violence support worker and counselor Lee Ann is the manager of Bernadette McCann House Women's Shelter.
There is family court, there is criminal court, and the two sort of don't cross paths. So you could have an abuser who's in criminal court, he has charges of assault, he could have 10 charges of assault, and that doesn't matter in family court.
University of Ottawa criminal law professor Elizabeth Sheehy.
There's not much by way of custody or access law that in any way can guarantee a woman that that child will not be forced to have visitation with that father, even if he's been violent to the mother, and sometimes even if he's been violent or abusive to the child.
You know, some things are beyond their control, and court is one of them. So it's hard to watch. And I know it's hard for the workers. I know it's really hard to see that, because their hands are tied. And the best they can do is, you know, sometimes you can go back and revisit the order.
Bernadette McCann House Executive Director Lee Sweeney.
You know, one of the interview questions we ask when we're hiring staff is, you know, Joey goes to his dad's place. His dad lives in the country. And dad is always asking about mom. What is mom doing? And the child has told you that they don't like that. So what do you help the child with? How do you help the child not answer those questions and not put the child at risk?
So we safety plan with the kids, and we chat about, you know, where is there a safe place that if something happened, do you know how to call 911? You know, is there a neighbor close by? Is there, can the access happen at an exchange center where it's safe to do so?
That's all part of safety planning, and we will bring the police in to do that training for us. And it's good for the kids to know that the police are good people. Sometimes they are not portrayed that way, and kids are afraid. They've been told many things. You can imagine if the parents been told those things, what the kid's been told.
Why do women stay? Well, there's your number one reason. My children are going to have access alone with that person who's abusive to me. They don't have me to abuse. Who are they going to abuse emotionally?
That whole custody access, you know, supervised access process needs to be looked at. You know, it's so hard to share custody with someone you're afraid of, you don't want to be around. And I appreciate that supervised access provides, you know, someone to come, drop off their child, come back. But it's the texting, it's the communication, it's you know, and it's that kind of viciousness that people are subjected to because they still have to have contact.
Sharon, a child and youth worker, is employed in an innovative program. She works with teens seeking help and children identified by mothers and schools to help them understand the dynamics of domestic violence, giving them tools to survive and ultimately reject behaviors which, all too frequently, go back generations.
We talk to the kids. We talk to the kids about the fact that it's not their fault. This is an adult situation. Adults we're all responsible for our own behavior, and the adults in your life are responsible for their behavior. It's not okay to hurt someone, even if you're angry. It's okay to be angry. Anger is one of the topics we talk about. Help them go through it and help them understand that, you know, there's tools to deal with your anger, because a lot of it is based on, well, they were angry or whatever. So we teach the kids that there's things you can do with your anger. That's not okay. That's not an okay way to display your anger, to hurt yourself or hurt others.
Social worker Rick Goodwin has been working with abusive men for 30 years, the last 20 as co-founder of an Ottawa agency helping men motivated to control their own anger, rage, and violence. Supporting children isolated in homes plagued by domestic abuse is significant, he says, from the perspective of boys in particular.
So if we look at what the conventional messages are to our boys and young men, well, you got to kind of tough it out in this life on your own. And there's lots of evidence to show that men, that's part of it. You know, you don't ask for directions, you don't go to a counselor if you need help. You know, you tough it out on your own, you're a lighthouse keeper. In the core of many men's experiences of rage and violence, that there is a fundamental issue of emotional dysregulation. That these men have not had particular learning of how to regulate their emotions, often because of problematic or abusive childhood that they experience or witnessing family violence in the home, conventional masculinity in the lives of boys and young men there are elements of that is relatively shaming. Don't cry, can't do that. Don't ask for help, can't do that. Express a vulnerable emotion, no, that's not good either. We can all experience shame. Victims of violence, victims of childhood abuse, of course, are much more prone to feeling shame. We refer to shame as the master emotion. We will do anything to escape from this experience. And so here's a more psychodynamic understanding of why someone is assaultive to someone they love, is that they're shame-prone. Why are they shame-prone? Because chances are they were abused. Okay, he's with her heterosexual couple in the kitchen. Coffee's too strong, coffee's too weak. Doesn't matter. Conflict builds. Conflict builds as someone who's shame-prone, the worst feeling in the world, at a certain point. The shame is then transferred onto the other person, projection in the psychological understanding of the word. She now is the notion of all badness. Shame means that I'm bad. Okay, but there's a projection where now the partner is the source of all badness, which gives then the fellow, if we're talking about a guy, a relative shame-free holiday.
Much of Sharon's work with vulnerable children is focused on countering feelings of shame and helplessness, a growing challenge in an age rife with violent images, language, and bullying, offering cover in many ways to the insidious effects of family violence.
I worked in the classroom as an EA, and when I look back now, I can see that through what I've learned working here is that there may have been a lot of children who were misdiagnosed with attention deficit or mild learning disabilities that may have been suffering from the effects of witnessing domestic violence.
People don't understand that children see everything. You may think that your yelling at night is not being heard. Think again. Those kids hear that. They're scared. And they pick up on things that people just think, oh, they didn't see that. They didn't see Dad, slam his fist on the fridge. They didn't see the fact that Mom was crying, or that they could hear her crying and he wasn't around.
In marked contrast to children, British law was crystal clear and deliberate in regards to women from the outset, explicitly directing the shame, frustration, and despair of oppressed men, or those who reasoned themselves so, toward women, a convenience surely contrived by larger ruling class interests, and framed misogyny as a self-evident feature of the human condition. Directing the shame, frustration, and or despair of oppressed men, or those who reasoned themselves so, onto women. University of Ottawa criminal law professor Elizabeth Sheehy.
At common law, husbands had the right to beat their wives with a stick that was no larger in diameter than their thumb. So this was called the rule of thumb. It was a common law principle that allowed men the authority to use violence against their wives. In Ontario in 1826, in a case called Hawley and Ham, the Ontario court adopted that rule and said that a man was entitled to engage in moderate chastisement and therefore use violence against their wives.
Sanctioned by law, generations of battered and abused women would find no refuge in the courts of Upper Canada, Canada West, or Ontario for over 2 centuries, giving shade to the ongoing notion that cruelty behind closed doors is a private family matter, and myths about domestic abuse based on victim blaming, mental illness, substance abuse, imported social values, or above all else, poverty, in a province with the highest rates of domestic murder per capita in all of Canada. Myths belied by provincial police statistics, showing 1 in 4 violent crime calls in 2018 were to private residences across the social spectrum, 1 in 3, the Canadian average, to homes with annual household incomes over $100,000, the majority involving female victims, 30% of whom held university degrees or college diplomas. Leanne blames much of that carnage on gaps in public education, a perspective born of 16 years of experience working with terrorized women of disparate backgrounds, most manipulated into blaming themselves for their own abuse.
I think that's a huge myth. I think all walks of life access services, from nurses to teachers to doctors, lawyers, and I think for those women who are in this, it can almost be a little more difficult because they carry this shame. I should know better, or I am employed, so what am I worried about? What are my concerns? Because at least I've got a job, and well, why did I wait this long? I think years ago, abuse was defined as physical violence. Abuse is way more than physical violence, as you know. We do see physical violence, but we also see a lot of emotional violence, financial abuse, control, a lot of intimidation tactics and threats.
Certainly talked about that you're not seeing as much of the physical, because people have clicked into that, right? So you're seeing more of the emotional, more of the mind games, more of the internet, more of that type. That's not, and when I say emotional, it's you don't see it. And I think the old myth of, well, if she doesn't have a bruise or he's got a mark on him, that it doesn't really exist. I think we have done work in that area for sure.
Studiously ignored by politicians, Canadian laws addressing acts of terror, ranging from relentless bullying, threats, and emotional abuse to physical assault, broadly defined as domestic violence, have not advanced since 1982, when the late NDP MP Margaret Mitchell was jeered in the House of Commons when she rose to address domestic assault, then commonly referred to as wife-beating or battering.
1 in 10 husbands beat their wives regularly, and these women, I don't think this is a very much of a laughing matter, Madam Speaker.
Prompting a public backlash, which even then forced the House Speaker to issue an apology to Mitchell, followed grudgingly by the passage of a law making it a crime for the first time for a husband to rape or sexually assault a wife or partner, while leaving in place sentencing guidelines which to this day treat domestic or partner murder as a lesser offense than the killing of a stranger. Professor Sheehy explains.
So in British law and Canadian law, wife killing was seen as really a form of chance medley, which was really a form of manslaughter, accidental killing. That characterization of wife killing as essentially manslaughter, not murder, goes hand in hand with a man's right to use violence to control or discipline his wife.
In 1976, Library and Archives Canada compiled a comprehensive record of homicides committed between Confederation in 1867 and 1962, the year capital punishment or execution was officially abolished. The study captures names of both victims and killers, motives, means, and outcome or disposition of each case. It includes the names of 127 men hanged for the murder of a spouse, ex-spouse, girlfriend, or lover. Among 231 others, 110 of them in Ontario, whose automatic death sentences for the murders of spouses, ex-spouses, girlfriends, and would-be girlfriends or lovers were commuted to prison terms, including W.H. Harvey of Guelph, a sensitive fellow, according to this report, who, upon being charged with embezzlement in 1899, returned home to line up and shoot his wife and 2 school-aged daughters before fleeing. A momentary act of madness, the Toronto Globe reporter speculates, inspired by a misplaced desire to spare them future disgrace. And George Copen of Seton Street in Toronto, who responded to a petition for financial support of his 4-year-old son in 1919 by bludgeoning his estranged wife Fannie Mae Copen with an iron bar, dousing her with an accelerant, and setting her alight. Spared the noose after his lawyer, a man with connections, successfully argued that her death might well have been an accident. And finally, the case of James McQuillan of Madoc Township east of Peterborough, an habitual abuser driven to murdering his wife in May 1876.
A most shocking cold-blooded murder was committed in the township on Sunday. James McQuillan, who had lived unhappily with his wife, from whom he separated in March, had returned to their home near the village of Bannockburn about 3 weeks ago, but his wife did not. After sending his father to negotiate for her return, she promised to meet him at his brother's and set out from a neighbour's with her children, aged 2 1/2 and 1 1/2 years. At about 10 o'clock, being seen in company with her husband, her carrying one child and he the other, while 4 hours later her dead body was found, lying by the roadside, horribly mutilated. The victim, Mary Ann Lynch, the horror of whose death was added to by the fact that she was far advanced in pregnancy, was aged about 19 years. She had been married to McQuillan for about 4 years.
McQuillan, even without an influential lawyer, had his sentence commuted to imprisonment at Kingston, where he appears, aged 38 and in good health, on a census 2 years later. An historical accounting which stands in sharp contrast to the fate of abused women who dared to defend themselves. The hanging of Elizabeth Workman at Sarnia in 1878, detailed in the opening of this documentary, had no public support. Every male of age in Sarnia Lambton had signed a petition for clemency presented to Conservative Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald by Liberal leader and arch-rival Alexander Mackenzie. Politics aside, Macdonald would find cover by consulting the judge in the case, and in doing so, ordered the execution to proceed. A contradiction explored in this legal text by Professor Sheehy.
Wife killing which was really a form of manslaughter, accidental killing. Husband killing has historically been viewed as the second most serious crime known to humankind. The first most serious crime is treason, killing or plotting to kill the king. Petty treason is killing or plotting to kill the little king, a woman's husband and master. And so petty treason, as the second most serious crime in England historically, carried a very severe and public form of execution.
Law and order firmly entrenched, George III would all but ignore Upper Canada, leaving his son and heir, another George, to respond to the burning of York by marauding Republicans, as Americans were then known, in March 1813. And in doing so, find new purpose for a British colony. As British monarchs concentrated on empire building, 9 million souls on the island of Great Britain had subsisted as tenants on massive rural estates, granted by royal grace and favour to titled and entitled peers of the realm, or mini-kings. Set to farming 20-foot strips of land known as run rigs and spinning thread for their lords and masters. While the fates of 6 million Irish, mostly Catholic and thus disqualified from owning property by previous order of King Henry VIII, relied on the whims of greedy absentee English and Scottish landlords. A feudal structure upended by the introduction of a workable steam engine, the computer of the 1700s, and the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, giving birth to factories, mills, mines, large-scale farming practices, and by the early 1800s, a nation of potential immigrants. Mechanization had done little to improve the prospects of the majority.
So you have the abolition of run-rig agriculture, which is these separate strips of land that are going to be consolidated. You have farms being consolidated for pasturage because raising sheep for wool and mutton will bring a far higher return to landlords than rents from small tenant farmers, the crofters.
Prompting widespread evictions or clearance of tenant farmers, a ruthless process characterized by the Duchess of Sutherland, residents of Dunrobin Castle, who notoriously evicted 15,000 tenants from her 1.5 million acre Scottish estate, burning out those old and young who had resisted. Homeless and starving, tenants had migrated to towns and villages, where they met a new ruling class of industrialists eager to capitalize on their plight. By employing women and children, where possible over men, at pitiful wages, women to operate machines 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, children as young as 4, often secured from orphanages and prisons, set to work in coal mines throughout northern England, crawling under heavy-moving looms at Scottish linen and cotton mills at Paisley and Glasgow and Manchester, England, at constant risk of death by crushing, mutilation, amputation, or suffocation. Workplace conditions abetted by British law, which held poverty to be a crime, punishable by hard labor in prison workhouses, deliberately made even crueler. Workhouse prisons deemed to be the responsibility of municipalities or parishes, built and operated by way of taxes on small property owners, scarcely removed from poverty themselves, and public donations. By 1776, 2,000 workhouses had been erected on the island of Great Britain alone, housing populations of over 100,000, including children, incarcerated under the guise of the religious concept of original sin. 9 of 10 dying in agony. Parents, stripped of hope and humanity, equally doomed. Workhouse conditions varied according to locale. However, the starvation deaths of James Eves, his wife, and 2 of their 3 children in 1759, 3 weeks after an illness, likely flu, forced them to seek shelter at Datchworth Workhouse in England, had little impact on anyone but the poor. Facing a Hobson's choice between death by workhouse, mine, mill, or factory, or prison sentences for offenses ranging from begging to minor theft, growing populations of families driven into slums rife with misery, filth, despair, and disease lived day to day, peddling random goods and services wherever they could. Leaving orphaned or abandoned boys like Dickens' composite character Oliver Twist and young girls prey to the depredations of those ostensibly further up the social scale. This obscene guide to young prostitutes, published annually over the last 3 decades of the 1700s, typifies social contempt for the poor and children in particular.
Miss B is a very genteel, agreeable little girl, and is distinguished more by the elegancy of her dress than the beauty of her person, which might perhaps have been ranked in the list of tolerables, had not the smallpox been quite so unkind. She is nevertheless a desirable, well-tempered piece, and one that does not degrade herself by her company or her actions.
The War of 1812, as harking back to high school, was a near-run thing. The Americans should have won. What is now Canada should have lost.
Historian Susan Code is a descendant of Irish immigrants settled at Perth in 1817, Upper Canada's first and only permanent military settlement.
Britain realized that she had been lucky and knew that she would not be so lucky the next time. So she asked the Duke of Wellington, who is riding a bit of a political high with his defeat of Napoleon, to come up with a defensive strategy for all of British North America.
Wellington advocated fortifications at Kingston, an inland supply route on the Rideau River linking to Ottawa, with a series of canals protected by soldiers gathered in a trio of proposed military settlements, starting at Perth.
Britain's got people all around the world, soldiers, and the last thing she wants to do is bring these people home. So the surveyors came in 1815 and laid out a town 1 mile square. The next spring, you start getting the discharged soldiers and half-pay officers and their families, and by the end of that summer, you have several boatloads of civilian settlers from the Glasgow area in Scotland. So Perth was an instant town. By the end of the summer of 1816, there were a couple of thousand people living here.
Assembled, ironically, in the very image of British society that Simcoe had planned 20 years before, and strictly maintained by officers empowered by transplanted wealth. While holding Scottish weavers and stonemasons, Irish immigrants, soldiers, and other ordinary folk landed without advantage, obedient to their own survival. Under the watchful eyes of frontier judges and administrators drawn from interconnected families, untroubled by issues of social justice or equality, and justifiably feared. A reassuring template. Acutely aware of the French Revolution and the bloody fates of rival King Louis XV, wife Marie Antoinette, and France's ruling class, King George IV and his prime or primary minister started to see a new use, beyond resources, for Upper Canada.
You have rampant unemployment. Of course, when you have rampant unemployment, you have wages plummeting. And you have a lot of poverty as a consequence. And you'd also had a lot of poverty in parts of Scotland, especially the Highlands, and of course Ireland. I mean, there was this lurking fear that there could be a sizable uprising on the part of the Irish. Well, they had the problem of overpopulation in certain areas and rampant poverty. And on this side, you had the need to secure an infant colony in Upper Canada. It became incumbent on the British government to try and promote the settlement of impoverished peoples.
Incumbent, expedient, and strategic. Inspired by the loyal, reliable inhabitants of Perth, King George studied the reputed successes of Thomas Talbot, the son of a friend directing settlement of the north shore of Lake Erie, and opted to subcontract out the settlement of Upper Canada to private developers, dispensing 5,000-acre townships or estates to men of pedigree willing to quit Britain to oversee emigrant settlements in exchange for adventure and opportunities to grow their own fortunes. The whole to be overseen by an exclusive Protestant patriarchy or clique based in York, soon to be infamously known as the Family Compact. Riven by profit and greed, the scheme would inevitably lead to widespread injustices, countless tragedies, and unspeakable hardship, giving rise to coping strategies still haunting Ontario families, and social values specific, if not exclusive, to the province, or what British Lord Durham would conclude was the most corrupt colony in North America. Settlers themselves would be drawn first from the densest, most troublesome corners of the kingdom, encouraged by financial incentives calculated to thin the ranks of the most desperate, disaffected, and rebellious. Passage offered in whole or part, subject to occupation, class, and location, with free 200-acre parcels of land for those willing to abandon extended family, friends, and the familiar for the promise of a new life in the colonial wilds.
Some of the poor and dispossessed were sent here by charitable institutions too, and by working class societies who helped offset their passage expenses. I think there were a fair number of those that were sent over. A fair number of people who were sent over by this means. There'd be a weaver society who might pay to to have some unemployed weavers sent over, and you know, various churches helped out. So the British government assisted the immigration of some of the poor from London, for example.
Compelled by hope and fear, courage and despair, over 275,000 refugees, half of them Irish, would set out for Upper Canada between 1829 and 1851.
You have individuals who came over on their own. I guess you'd call them middle class today, because, and they had the means to do this, because they felt that with the stratified British class system, they felt their prospects would be better in the New World. I think they were in a minority.
But it was an incredibly risky proposition to get on a ship, and lots of them went down, and cross the Atlantic and come to the bush and start a new life. I don't think we appreciate the guts that it took to undertake that.
Mary Campbell's ancestors, an innovative cooper or barrel and stave maker, and his wife crossed the Atlantic in 1825, preserving a rare detailed account of their journey from Scotland to the south shore of the lower Ottawa River.
It was a relatively new ship, and its cargo was coal. So it would have been a lot of coal dust. You got allocated, your family got, and I think there were 134 maybe people, 80 families, and you got allocated your bunk. So 2 parents and the 2 children had one bunk against the hull of the ship. And, you know, it was all chamber pots, and yes, there'd be a communal fire where you could cook something if you had something.
Cramped in holds rife with human fluids and disease for weeks to months, tens of thousands of migrants, including the Campbell's infant daughter, would die at sea, leaving newly orphaned children, widows and widowers to disembark, frequently amongst the ailing at Grosse Ile, a barren island south of Quebec City, fitted with sheds posing as hospitals and rocky graveyard. Leading many, particularly during Ireland's potato famine in the mid-1840s, the failure of a lone crop amidst a harvest of plenty, to refer to emigrant vessels as coffin ships, while those who arrived alive often found themselves completely stranded. Private developers were ostensibly bound by government terms, but in reality frequently acted in their own best interests. Most emigrants, fueled by varying combinations of hope and fear, would find themselves alone at Quebec City, 600 miles removed from Upper Canada.
The culture shock would have been absolutely gut-wrenching, I guess is a way of saying it. And some people survived and some people did not. You would have left a place where, first of all, you probably never went further than the next parish, where everything is developed. Here, there's nothing. I shouldn't say nothing. It's trees, it's rivers, it's rock.
Mary's first cousin, Duncan Campbell, picks up the story of their ancestors who had accepted a loan financed by the cousin of a bankrupt laird, or Lord Archibald McNabb, to journey to his self-named township at the eastern tip of Renfrew County.
It was gruesome. It was, there was nothing. They came up the creeks. They came from Montreal, and then they came to Arnprior. Then you had to work your way up to your claim, your allotted land, and then you got up and you made a camp. They all cut into the banks of the creeks, and then they made a wooden roof, and they dug into the soil, and then that was where you had to spend your first winter.
So the deal was, when you came, you got a location ticket for your lot. Front half of, we're sitting here at the front half of lot 12 on concession 12. And you had to do so many improvements. So you had to clear 3 acres and build a 12 by 18 foot cabin.
It's like the creeks were full of these minnows. They were a good sized minnow. They're 5-6 inches long. They're quite fat, and there's millions of them. So you could easily, you didn't starve. But a lot of them had, like, they never saw this kind of cold, like from Scotland, like serious frostbite. So there were stories of my grandfather or my uncles, they'd have to cut their fingers off, like frostbite, right? So you'd have to cut your own, amputate.
As a rule, you had 3 years to fulfill the obligations in order to get full title. And if you did not fulfill those obligations, well, then you lost everything.
An eccentric misogynist, Thomas Talbot, with royal connections through his wealthy father, an Irish lord, ultimately controlled 650,000 acres of land, encompassing 130 miles of Lake Erie shoreline, and the fates of tens of thousands of emigrant families, issuing imperious edicts over the title Father of the Settlement. Marooned in a landscape carpeted in primeval forest, emigrants set about felling trees, seeding potatoes and turnips between stumps, unsupported, if not obstructed, by tyrants the like of Thomas Talbot and Archibald MacNab.
MacNab showed up at a farm and set fire to the barns, and the mother was going crazy because her kids, of course, liked to play in the barns and thought they were hiding in there. Well, he was looking for the husband because you weren't supposed to leave the township without permission from MacNab. And of course, the men frequently had to work elsewhere to get enough money to keep their families together. So her husband was absent, and MacNab went up to get him, to arrest him, and the mother, he hauled back. He couldn't find the husband, so she was upset about her kids, who were okay, but they hauled her back. He took the cattle as payment because he figured he was owed, and brought her back to Kinnell Lodge from White Lake without a coat or anything in the middle of the winter. So it was this kind of nonsense.
They'd have to work in the field. The husbands were gone all winter. They went to the shanty. They'd be gone the entire winter. You'd have to do the chores, raise the kids, and keep it all together. She'd definitely have to have a garden, yeah, and pigs. And then I know my great-grandmother, she'd guard the pigs all night. Like, there was wild animals back then, a little more wildlife, like there was bears, and everybody wanted to eat pigs, so she set up her chair on top of the pig pen. The pig pen was low, like it was a little building, and then you'd set your chair on top, and she'd sit there at night. They didn't have a gun. There was not too many guns around at that time, so she had an axe.
Unlike the daughters of aristocrats, British working-class women had had the option of staving off marriage until their mid, even late 20s, trading love, or at least deep affection, for assuming the very real risk of death by childbirth, leading to narrower windows of fertility, which combined with the frequent deaths of children had led to smaller families in many corners of Great Britain, an unsustainable approach to life in Upper Canada.
Children, I mean, you needed them. You needed them. There wasn't the luxury of they had to haul water. You needed somebody to haul. We didn't have running water, so somebody had to bring the water. Somebody had to look after the smaller children. There's no birth control, or very unreliable birth control, so it comes down to necessity. Just cooking alone is a full-time job. Laundry takes a whole day. Water, drawing water, like all of these things, it takes a community to do it.
Often malnourished, worn down by work indoors and out, many women felt driven to risk annual pregnancies in an era continuing past World War I in Ontario, where 3 out of 4 babies died before the age of 1, and children were lost to every malady imaginable.
Dad had a story, I've forgotten the name of the family, but while the husband was away, the kids got cholera. And I have an occasion in my own family of cholera, but it was rife during the 19th century. And all the kids died, one by one, and she kept the bodies in the creamery, frozen in the creamery, because she couldn't dig the graves, and waited for her husband to come home. So he came home to find his whole family, other than his wife, gone. Well, yes, I think Dad said that there were 6 kids.
Tragedies weathered, or not, by those whose own survival depended on relentless toil. Without time or space for grief, tenderness soon became a liability, rupturing bonds between mother and child, and creating a layer of families, in the exquisite words of Irish novelist Maeve Binchy, too poor to afford affection. A social order accepted by more educated and advantaged female emigrants. Indomitable botanist and writer Catherine Parr Traill, author of the popular Female Emigrant's Guide and Hints on Canadian Housekeeping, circa 1855, sums up the thinking of the era best.
I have observed with much surprise that there is no class of emigrants more discontented than the wives and daughters of those men who were accustomed to earn their bread by the severest toil, in which they too were, by necessity, obliged to share, often with patience and cheerfulness, and who should feel the difficulties of a settler's life far less keenly than any other.
Born into struggling households, teenagers, particularly girls, were encouraged to move on.
You were either a housekeeper or you got married.
Raised with little in common beyond endless toil and barren childhoods, many couples had no idea of how to recognize or communicate feelings. Lives driven by relentless toil, sacrifice, and unspent grief, men and women throughout the 1800s coped as best they could. Men conditioned to stoicism or frustration, exercised in the form of violence behind closed doors. Women urged to endure, improve, do more. Sufficient to merit commercial exploitation, or, amongst more discreet families, home remedies born of desperation.
Like a good instrument. Like it was a big box, like a wooden box, and there was electrodes, and I think it looked like as long as I think you put your fingers on, and then you cranked her, and then I think they used a lot of shock therapy back then for depression. Like there would have been a lot of depression, like for women. Oh yeah.
So-called common law offered little in the way of rights to the common man, and none to children. A calculated, historical posture relied upon by the British and Canadian governments to support the for-profit trafficking of over 120,000 indentured British children, or slaves, here to Canada between Confederation in 1867 and the eve of World War II. 10,000 of them to farms and villages here in Ontario. A joint scheme originally conceived to relieve Britain of growing numbers of impoverished children and free up Canadian farm children to attend schools. Initially supported, but soon opposed by men like psychiatrist Charles Clark, founder of the Clark Institute in Toronto, who did not object to importing child labor per se, but soon insisted on what he referred to as a better class of child, arguing that the importation of impoverished children bearing, quote, the stigmata of physical and mental degeneracy would end in the pollution of Ontario's gene pool.
And that was a common thought throughout Canada. So it started way back in the beginning. It never stopped. Up until the very end of these programs, these children were still labeled that way.
Laurie Ovchesky is the head of British Home Children Research and Advocacy, a resource centre for Canadian descendants of those children, searching for answers to family mysteries dating back generations, and in the process, she hopes, restoring dignity and meaning to the lives of their ancestors.
In 1897 in Ontario here, there was a law that was put into place, and that law was to protect us against these children. And they were restricting the types of child that could be brought into this country.
Initially founded as an alternative to workhouses in the 1860s by compassionate individuals like Dr. Thomas Bernardo and William Quarrier, British children's homes had grown to offer shelter and sustenance to children whose parents had nowhere else to turn in times of trouble.
In England, they built institutions that were used to house the poor. And the workhouse conditions, they were made to be worse than the worst living condition possible. So where these institutions that were immigrating children to Canada where they got their little edge on the whole thing is they built institutions that housed children that were far better than the workhouse system. And they all boasted like an ever open door policy. They didn't want to turn away any child in need. But in order to keep that policy up, I mean, their organizations got so overcrowded with children that they had to create a backdoor. They had to alleviate that overburdening of children in their institution. That backdoor led to Canada. Now, when we go back to the organizations such as Bernardo's and Quarriers and Fagan House and Middlemore, it was written in their contracts that they had the right to immigrate these children. That was the parents' consent. I'd have to say that the average parent wouldn't understand the child care laws, and I don't think that half the parents that were turning their children over were literate. They couldn't read.
Children transported to nearly 50 so-called receiving homes between Ottawa and Hamilton to be distributed by age and gender and without regard to siblings, to any adult willing to sign a contract agreeing to keep them, under unspecified conditions, until or if they reached 18.
In Park Lawn Cemetery in Toronto, we discovered the bodies of 75 children. And in 2016, we put a monument up. There are 2 mass graves of children. There are graves that were meant for 25 bodies. There's 75 children crammed in there. 75 children that were discarded, abandoned, buried, forgotten. We have suicides. We have medical deaths. And we have babies. And we have unwed mothers. Sexual abuse of these children, the girls, was rampant. It was a huge problem. So big that Dr. Bernardo had to open maternity homes in Toronto. My Aunt Mary, who came to Peterborough, was moved 20 times in 8 years. One farmer left her on the side of the road. She gave birth to a stillborn baby on the farm. Yeah, the terms of the indenture would really depend upon the age of the child. I mean, if you have a child coming over at the age of 7, they're going to be indentured until they're 18.
Leaving adult survivors alone, many, mute with shame, seeking some degree of normalcy by establishing families of their own.
I think that what we have to remember with the home children is the vast majority of these children went on and made good lives for themselves in Canada. The vast majority married and had children. It's now estimated that we have about 4 million descendants of home children in Canada. We talked to the survivors, and we talked to their first and second generation descendants. I mean, those are the things that is the most common, is the difficulties that they had in raising their own families. I mean, when you're told that you're a nobody, that you're garbage, and you're treated that way, it's a cycle of abuse. And you see the cycle of abuse in today's women. I mean, when you're abused, and when you're beaten, and when you're told that you're garbage, and when you're told that you're no good, when you're told to get out, nobody wants you here. You begin to believe that the problem is you, and that you've done wrong, and that you deserve this, and that you need to try harder. And if you try harder, things are going to get better. And it just doesn't, because you're not the fault.
I think children live what they learn. And I think if they're taught, I don't want to say it's across the board, because not all children who live with abuse become abusive or become victims in an abusive situation. But it is an intergenerational cycle, and we've seen it here. We've had mums here, 20 years ago, and we've had their child here as a victim and also as an abuser. So we've seen it. So it is intergenerational for sure. But I don't think that's their path. that they have to, they're, because you grew up in an abusive home, you're going to be an abuser.
Well, there's no question that our failure as a society to intervene and protect children costs us all in the long run. Those children's lives are treated as expendable and infinitely reparable, which they're not. So there's no question that there's a serious issue there in terms of whether and how we intervene to protect kids, and whether and when we believe children, when they tell us what's happening.
Lee Sweeney is acutely aware of the historic origins of domestic violence. Supported by a progressive board of directors, she has worked with staff for over a decade to develop and implement programs for not only women and children, but men, often in coordination with other agencies. In 2018, staff, answering Bernadette McCann House Women's Shelter and Support Services Crisis Line, responded to 1,117 calls, including 39 from men. Provided support to 316 women and 183 children through outreach programs. Worked with 19 men to improve their parenting skills through a program jointly sponsored by Renfrew County Family and Children's Services. Admitted 74 women and 66 children to their residential shelter. 70% of mental health problems begin during childhood or adolescence. 17% of Ontario children aged 2 to 5 now meet the diagnostic criteria for mental health problems. 62% of Ontario youth report ongoing problems with stress, anxiety, or depression. 5 out of 6 will not get the treatment or support they need.